Well, I see that the clock has turned to 1 o'clock, so that means we can get underway here. And I want to thank all of you for attending Table Talks today. This is our 4th edition, and very excited about the guests we've had so far. I'm very excited about the guest we have today. For those of you who are new to Table Talks, what Table Talks is about is that it's an opportunity to have insightful conversations with leaders in the legal profession, mainly in the in-house community. And as your host, it's a huge pleasure for me to be able to spend time with these folks talking about the issues that they have on their plate and more broader issues as well. So thank you very much for joining us today. And as I have in the past, we'll be finished by 2 o'clock Eastern time. To our Western guests, good morning, and to our Eastern guests, good afternoon. Thomas Kim's path to becoming General Counsel and Company Secretary for one of Canada's iconic brands and corporate jewels is fascinating. And we spent some good time prior to this call today just chatting about things as we've done in the past. And what I learned last time was really that Thomas's career aligns with this quote from Stephen Jobs, which is, "You can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards." So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. And you have to trust something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever. This approach has never let me down and has made all the difference in my life. And I think, Thomas, that's a good description. And thank you for identifying it for me, because maybe that's a good one for me as well. But that seems to be you and your career, and a fascinating one, which we're going to explore today. You know, with younger lawyers in particular, I get asked for advice around career and sort of their approaches that they should be taking. In fact, I had a call with an articling student the other day, and she was trying to plan out her entire life. And I said, wait a minute. I said, there's 2 things I think that matter. One is that sometimes it's the job that no one wants, or the job that has the greatest risk that actually be the most benefit to you in how you build your career, and might be the most impactful in your career. And the second thing is that don't overthink things, particularly when you're young. Be curious, open-minded, and you know, your career path will not always be the one that you think it'll be. It'll be something different. And I think that's a very good description of you, Thomas, today. So I'm very pleased to have Thomas with me today, General Counsel, Corporate Company Secretary for Thomson Reuters, as I said. And so I'd just like to thank you, Thomas, for spending this hour with me. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Ken, for having me on Table Talk. It's great forum, and I'm privileged to be guest number 4. The other sessions were wonderful, so I hope that we can do justice by this one.
I just want you to know I was saving the best till session 4. Okay.
Right.
So look, I mean, Thomson Reuters, we could spend a long time talking about what it is, but you know, when I looked it up, it's had a very simple statement around I guess your purpose, and that is to be a leading provider of business information services. And the purpose of Thomson Reuters was to inform the way forward, which seems like a wonderful kind of simple description of the kind of business you have. But it's not a simple business. It's about a $6.4 billion in revenue by the latest count of about a month ago. Revenue company, you had 6% growth, so you know, great success. I noticed that there were 5 segments, and your biggest segment was the legal professional corporation, and that was, sorry, legal professionals. That was the largest sector of the 5, and also corporate tax and accounting, Reuters News, and global print. So sort of a really interesting global company, really providing information services. But you've been with it for a long time. So is that a kind of an accurate description of what Thomson Reuters is?
Absolutely. You know, for those folks who know a little bit about the history of the Thompson Corporation, you know, there's been different businesses that we have been in and that we've exited, but at the heart of it, still, I think, is the first newspaper and then the first radio stations that the Thompson family owned, and began the Thompson Corporation. And at one time, we actually owned 150 newspapers around the world. So we're no longer just purely a media company, but along the way, we've been in and out of other businesses. But at its heart has always been, I think, this real passion for information and understanding its value. And so I'm delighted that, as we are sitting here in 2022, one of the things that began the journey of this company still remains its main purpose, which is, to inform our customers. And so I think it accurately captures sort of where our heart is. And I think how that manifests in each of those different customer segments that you talk about is going to be quite different, because we're in such a period of rapid change. So it's great to draw upon our history and then to use that as the foundation to really think about how we can help our customers and help our stakeholders evolve for all the changing needs that we foresee in the near future.
Must be remarkable, because you're at the front end of it. And I love that around the fact that you haven't lost sight of the fact of the origins of the Thompson dynasty, and including the fact that global print is still one of the five pillars within Thomson Reuters. You also have I think I would say a fairly famous former, was she a Reuters or a Thompson side, in Chrystia Freeland. She was, obviously everybody knows her now as the finance minister for Canada.
That's right. I mean, we were Thomson Reuters at the time, but so you're both right in whether Reuters or Thomson Reuters, because she was a part of Thomson Reuters, but she was an editor at Reuters, which is the brand that we have maintained as our news division. And we're delighted that she's been successful in her career. And as someone who used to live in her writing up until a couple of months ago, I'm delighted for that as well.
Yeah, no, wonderful. So I'd like you, if you don't mind, just describe a little bit about the Office of General Counsel at Thomson Reuters. And I say that because I can't imagine what it'd be like working for a large, massive technology company in the spaces that you're in. How do you lead that? How do you establish your group? And tell me a little bit about it.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful opportunity for anyone to sort of both be a general counsel and in a corporate legal department, but also to work for a company that has as its largest base of customers lawyers. So it's one of the great things about being in our legal department is that we are both supporting the sale and maintenance of our products, but also using our own products. And so part of what we do is try to figure out how can we help our colleagues in product and engineering in terms of the tools that we sell. And so I'm super excited. We just closed a deal of an acquisition of an artificial intelligence company that does really wonderful natural language processing called ThoughtTrace. And so while I'm excited as the chief legal officer that we closed the acquisition, I'm also incredibly excited as a customer to see how that will be incorporated. And then a fun tidbit about that is our Office of the General Counsel is going to be the first testers of new ways of using that technology. So that's just a part of just showing a little bit of the unique aspect of being in our legal department as opposed to others. I would say another really fun, and I think something that's really a privilege that we have is we have this news division, Reuters, that's incredibly important. And we, unlike many media organizations, we are still very much committed to being independent, having high integrity, and being free from bias. That's something we take really seriously at Thomson Reuters. We actually have a separate corporate entity called the Thomson Reuters Founders Share Company that exists purely to make sure that we abide by the trust principles. And the Founders Share Company has the right to veto any corporate action that we otherwise might be planning to take if they thought it was in contravention of the trust principles. And we work very closely with them. And we work within the system of governance to make sure that not only Reuters, our news division, but that all of the parts of Thomson Reuters hold true to the trust principles. That can be difficult at times because I think anyone who's worked within a framework of governance knows it's wonderful because it stops you from sort of going beyond the borders of where you need to go. But also when it's a good set of governance, whether it's a constitution or whether it's laws or regulations, abiding by rules and governance at times can be inconvenient. And I think even now, covering situations, for example, conflict in foreign lands and other kinds of political situations, I think we pay much more attention to being objective and not trying to take a political viewpoint than other people do. And we take that very seriously. The general counsel's office is one of the parts of the company, along with the editorial parts of our company, including the journalists who are very much focused on that. So that's another sort of unique aspect of what we do as well, which I've had the privilege of really enjoying over my 22 years with the company.
Isn't that something? That's fascinating. So what role do you play on the trust then? Do you serve as general counsel to the trust as well, or is that separately constituted?
It's separately constituted. Now, the interesting history about the trust, we now talk about trust as a value, but actually, if you look back in history about why it's called a trust and why we call it the trust principles, is actually a lot more legally specific. So for the legal nerds on our table talk, they might enjoy this. During World War II, and you can imagine what a tumultuous and difficult time that it was, Reuters at that time was facing financial difficulties, and the then chief executive was in secret talks with the British government to get some emergency funding in exchange for giving favorable press coverage to the Allied war effort during World War II.
Wow.
Now, you can imagine, if you think about the vast span of history and thinking about causes that would clearly be right or wrong, it'd be hard pressed to find a moment of greater clarity than World War II. But even at that time, people understood the unique role that Reuters plays. And when the board of directors found out the chief executive was in these conversations, that chief executive was ousted. Now, because that deal with the British government fell apart, that meant we were in financial straits. What actually happened was the press associations from around the Commonwealth, around the British Commonwealth, including in the UK, in Australia, folks in Canada, banded together and they formed a nonprofit trust. So it was actually a legal trust to bail Reuters out, in effect, and to preserve Reuters. And so in exchange for setting up that trust, they built into the organizational governance of the corporation these trust principles. Now, it is just conveniently a synonym for actually the value that we also abide by. But it started off as a legal form. So it was an actual trust, and the original sort of what we call now the directors of the founder share company were originally called trustees. And so if you look at old movies or old newspaper articles, you might hear about the Reuters trustees, and that's who they're referring to. When the Reuters group floated in the 80s, that was converted from an actual legal trust into a separate company, which is now the Thomson Reuters Founder Share Company. So that's a little bit of both journalism history and legal history for those who are either history or legal buffs out there.
Isn't that something? So is it almost acts like a filter then for decisions being made, not just in journalism, but also in terms of the work you do in the other sectors, the other 4 sectors?
You're absolutely right, Ken. And I think there's very few corporations left that operate in this way. And if there are, I don't imagine that they have as diverse a business as we do, or as global as we are. But I think all of us at Thomson Reuters take incredible pride that we not only abide by the trust principles, but that helps us to support what we believe is the world's best news organization, covering stories in a way that no one else can from all over the world.
Fascinating. Okay, well, that's a marvelous story. That's a book in itself. I'm gonna look into that, because I think that's wonderful, because companies will talk about this in terms of their principles, but to have something so historical and so founded on something so important is incredible for an organization. So I didn't know that. Excellent.
Yeah, and I would say, Ken, the other part of sort of our values comes from our Canadian origins. So the trust principles come out of the Reuters part of our corporate history, and Reuters was acquired by the Thompson Corporation. But if you go back to our Canadian roots, we're talking about good Canadian family values of small town newspapers, small town media, feeling a real connection to our audience, being responsible to our customers because you see them on the streets, you know them. And, we still have in our hearts, I think, a lot of those Thompson family values that are really something that I think all Canadians could relate to. And, we're a humble corporation. We have a humble culture. And I think that stems from that.
Amazing. So speaking of humble, I mean, I loved our conversation around your origins. And I think it's important. I mean, we are who we are, formed over years, and each one of us is unique. But your story is unique in terms of your coming to Canada and how that all happened. Tell the audience a little bit about that, because I think it's important also in respect of the company you now work for and the values it has.
Well, absolutely. I think, we always within Thomson Reuters love the stories of folks who sort of are able to come from humble beginnings. And as you mentioned, Ken, I certainly did. My father came to the United States to study for a master's in theology in the 70s. And at that time, he left behind his wife and 3 children in South Korea. And South Korea at that time was a very poor country, and the situation was very difficult. And my family was not different from that situation. He left his wife with, a 50-pound bag of rice and $100 and went off to sort of make his way. And he was both putting himself through graduate seminary and also working jobs as a busboy, doing landscaping work, and trying to send money back to Korea to take care of his family. Unfortunately, I got ill with pneumonia. I was around 3 at the time. And you can imagine how difficult it was for my mother to be raising 3 kids in what was then a third world country, as a single parent. During a very difficult time. And she wrote to my father and she said, I think you're going to have to come back because your son is really ill and we can't afford to send him to hospital and he needs some help. And so my father then went to the pastor who was sponsoring him. He was at that time in Texas, and he was being sponsored actually by a gentleman by the name of Reverend John Elliott, who was a very distinguished and much beloved pastor of a Black church in a working class, a middle class Black church in Dallas, Texas. And that church, Hamilton Park United Methodist Church in Dallas, Texas, raised the money, their hard-earned money they pulled together to bring my mother and my 2 sisters and myself from Korea to the United States so that we could be in a better situation, so that I could have all the opportunities that I currently have enjoyed. And it's always been a really, I think, pivotal moment in my life when I look back, because it's a theme that's played out before, which is sometimes, the people who need your help and the people that you need to reach out to may not look like you. We may not have the same last names. We may not speak the same language, but human beings are human beings. And the ability for people to understand that need across these superficial differences and to make these connections, that's what makes society stronger and better. And that's a spirit that I've kept with me. And during my career, I've been lucky enough to try to pay that back. I've been lucky enough to be given an opportunity to become the chief legal officer for such a great and distinguished company as Thomson Reuters, and to be a part of the Canadian legal establishment. And I know, Ken, I've always been a big fan of yours because of all the great work you have done similarly. And I think for those of us who are lawyers, I do think we probably take a little bit more seriously than maybe some other professions, the need that we have, if we're fortunate enough to be successful, to shine a light on those who need some other help, and to be active in our communities, to be active with nonprofit work and charities and pro bono services. And it's one of the great gifts of being a lawyer, is that we can both practice our craft, but in addition, help really worthy causes in some areas that are quite difficult. So it's been just a wonderful way for me to always be reminded that at the heart of what I should be doing, it all became possible because of public service and an idea of public service to our fellow human being. And, maybe we didn't have the words diversity, equity, and inclusion back then in the 70s, but that's certainly what it was, right? And so to me, it is a living, breathing concept that made my whole life and career possible.
Isn't that something? And you gave it, I think you were quoted as saying that the obligation of lawyers is to give a voice to the voiceless, right. If I recall, which I guess comes from that as well. And you came, you moved, when you moved to Dallas, you moved into that community, correct? I mean,
That's right.
you became a part of their community and I guess a part of their congregation as well and grew up in that.
Well, my father actually had his own congregation because my father was a pastor, and so we
Okay.
had a small Korean church as well. But we stayed close to that family, and actually, when I applied to college, when I applied to Stanford University, I wrote my entrance essay about Reverend Elliott. And unfortunately, he passed away during my freshman year of college, and I remember going back to the funeral and just hearing all the different people, my father included, who were given an opportunity to stand up and say some words at his funeral and talking about how this one person had made an impact in their lives. And I think for any of us who are lawyers, if we sometimes wonder if it's worth the effort
Right.
From our busy schedules to do pro bono services or to do all of the charitable work that we can, it's to think about all the times that you touch someone's life and how that then has a cascading effect. Because certainly at Reverend Elliott's funeral, I was struck by how many people, including our own family, have been touched by the generosity and the care of this man. And so I think we all have an opportunity to touch so many lives. And so it's one of the great things about being a lawyer. We not only have the ability to do so because we're successful within our careers, but we have some actual skills and capabilities that people do need to have access to make it a more just society.
That's something. It's a natural leadership role too, being a lawyer, and to not realize that your shoulders are broader by virtue of that and do something with it is a loss and a waste, I think, of a career. I think you and I are on the same page on that one. And you went to Stanford. So off to California you went, and you graduated from law school at Stanford, and then joined Baker McKenzie. Hancock, Rothert, and Bunchoft, and then over to Baker McKenzie. And then you moved in-house, and I'm curious about why you decided to make the move in-house. Clearly you were a successful lawyer in private practice.
Well, it's actually an interesting question, because at the time that I made the move, I had not been planning to make a move. At that time, the traditional path to becoming an in-house counsel was to first make partner in a law firm. And then you would typically lateral over from being a partner who was the primary outside counsel for a company to becoming their general counsel. So I assumed that would be the path that I would take. I was very happy at Baker McKenzie. I was working for some great partners who, some of them remain close friends of mine to this day. So I wasn't looking to leave, but I was recruited for a position that was in a startup that was a spinoff of Reuters at that time. And it was an opportunity, it was a rare opportunity to go in-house as a litigator, which was what I was at that time. And actually, it was a month before an IPO of a spinoff that we had. So I was able to participate in the IPO, which was a great experience for me. It was a successful IPO. The owner of that company now owns the Sacramento Kings, so I think he did okay. By that, I stayed with Reuters and helped sort of fold the remaining parts of that business in Palo Alto back into the main corporation. And then I moved from Palo Alto to the New York office the following year. So it was the beginning of a great career and a great global career with the company.
And that was in what, 1999 or 98? I forget.
Yes, I purposely elided over the fact that one of the things I was doing in 1999, and you might chuckle, Ken, if you remember this, was I was dealing with Y2K.
Yes.
So for the young folks that are on our call, they might think, why would anyone have thought that was serious? But I mean, it was actually the first thing that I did was to deal with that. And then once we got through that period and we had sort of folded the remnants of the spinoff back into the main corporation, I moved to New York in 2000.
That's so funny. I have to tell you a quick story on that, Thomas. You'll laugh. I was the lawyer responsible for Y2K at an international airline at the time.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, of course, part of my job was keeping the board from panicking that the planes were going to fall out of the sky. And you can imagine every flight had about 200,000 components to it that you all had to be Y2K certified. You remember that? Well, we'd spent a lot of time and effort on that. And when the night came, of course, nothing happened. Was it because we did our work or because there was nothing there in the first place? I think it's the latter. Anyway, the funny thing was that nobody flew. So just on the day of, Richard Branson, operating Virgin, just canceled all his flights for 3 days, gave his staff 3 or 4 days off, and never had to worry about Y2K. So that was another way to deal with it.
Well, I remember, you might relate to this, Ken. I remember I was in a bunker in Palo Alto, starting with New Year's Eve in Australia. And the last New Year's that we were waiting for was our local New Year's, which was in California. So basically up for 24 hours, waiting for all these things to happen. Nothing happened. And I remember emerging from the bunker on New Year's Day thinking, well, I've got some extra time. So it was quite an experience.
It was, boy, we spent a lot of money, didn't we, on all of that. But anyway, and then I think it was a slump after that because everybody had upgraded their technology, so they didn't buy for a while.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing, just going back to the slump, and this is actually something that's quite useful to remember for people who haven't lived through a down cycle. There was always going to be a down cycle at some time, and it was, in the late 90s, it was incredibly frothy. We think times are frothy now, but it was even more intense back then. And I remember in 1999. I went out to dinner with some friends, my wife and I did, and we were talking about all the different things that were happening in the companies that we saw. And it was apparent to me that a lot of these companies did not really have good business models, and it didn't make a lot of sense. And so I remember the 3 families that were there, the 3 couples that were there, we were all saying, we think this thing's going to pop. And, we should probably all get out of Silicon Valley before that does. And I remember all those 3 couples did leave, and it all came crashing down in 2000. As I thought it would, not because I was prescient, but it just seemed like people had stopped caring about what the business actually did. People were just interested on whether or not they could IPO and whether they could, sort of make their buck. I have been fortunate enough to have practiced through a couple of these booms and busts, both in, North America, and also I was through a China boom. And so it's given me some perspective. And I know right now it looks like there's no end to asset price inflation and all these kinds of things, but it's taught me one has to be prepared for both the up and down cycles in business.
Mm-hmm. So true. Yeah, no, there's some value in having wisdom from experience, that's for sure. And that leads me then to that discussion around, when I looked at your career, I don't know that I've seen so many moves within one career. I think over basically a decade. You had, I think the count I had was about 14 different positions within Reuters and then within Thomson Reuters. And, over your 23 years within the corporation, and that was both in Asia and the United States and different places within the US as well, with a range of responsibilities. It was really something. And I don't want to go through each of them, but, it's interesting just to reflect on a few of them. Both in terms of the responsibilities, but also in terms of location. What I'm going to ask you at the end is how that all came to bear upon who you are now as general counsel at Thomson Reuters. What was interesting was you started out in compliance, and there's many lawyers today who have the question, is that a good career move, moving into compliance, or am I sort of moving out of law and no longer will be a part of a legal team? But you came right back in after about a year as legal counsel, moved up to senior legal counsel, and then sort of increasing seniority in those legal positions, but then went back into senior VP and head of global compliance at, I guess that would have been Reuters at that time, for just over a year, then moved into the markets division, then was general counsel of Asia markets, which meant a move from New York to Hong Kong and then to China. And that was just over a year. And then another legal position, a general counsel of global growth and operations. And then you went to chief compliance officer at Thomson Reuters and GC. That was almost 3 years. So you went back to New York. And then this is the interesting one, managing director China for 2 years. And we'll talk about that in a minute, where you were in Shanghai and Beijing, which was not a legal role, but was a business role for 2 years. And then you came back and were general manager of global separation execution, which sounds like you're creating your own grave, career grave anyway, within the organization, but it wasn't. You came out of that and were appointed chief legal officer and company secretary in August of 2019. That's almost 3 years. And that's when you and I met, when you moved up to Toronto. And we talked at that time, and that was not that long before the pandemic hit. So if I look at that 23 years, many different positions within an organization, and that leads us back to that discussion around, how did that career journey impact your career now as general counsel? And for those listening in, what should they take away from it?
Well, it's, one of the reasons why I mentioned that Steve Jobs quote to you, Ken, it's resonated with me, and it has for many years, is because just as you recited, I had a lot of different moves. And what motivated each of them at the time was more of a interest in what was fascinating to me and what was challenging to me, and not necessarily what would make logical choice at the time. I think now some of the moves that I made, including going to the business and going to different parts of the organization and moving between litigation and compliance, is probably a lot more common than it was when I was coming up. But at the time, it was a very risky move. But I came out of Silicon Valley where people take massive risk, and what motivates people in high technology sectors, whether it's Palo Alto or it's Ottawa or somewhere else, is a passion for an idea, and so to me, I've always wanted to do what I thought was the most interesting thing for me, and then had to trust that from a career perspective that it will work out. So going just back to this one specific job about, running a P&L and running China, that was a huge move for me. Now, a number of years, I had been asked to go run different businesses. I'd been lucky enough to have good relationships with the presidents of the business that I supported when I was a general counsel. And they said, well, you're very smart, you're a great operator, and you're great at execution. We think you could be really good in the business sector. And I always turned it down. And I remember I was in a moment of contemplation talking to my wife about it. And I said, you know what? I should really make sure that I don't want to do this, because at some point, if I keep on saying no, they will stop asking. Mm-hmm. And so at that point, I talked to my boss, which was a president of a business unit at a time. And he asked me again. And I said, well, for the right job, I would do it. He surprised me by coming back a week later and saying, how would you like to go and run China? So China at that time was about $130 million in annual revenue. I had never been a salesperson. I'd never run sales. I'm not Chinese. I don't speak Chinese. So what I was being asked to do was incredibly difficult for me and would be a huge stretch. And so I thought about all the different reasons why probably I should say no. But it came down to, I thought to myself, why am I always saying no to these things? And I came to the conclusion, just being honest with myself, I was afraid of failing. And I think it's something that lots of lawyers have a really tough time doing. And here's a fundamental difference between someone who's a salesperson and someone who's a lawyer. Many lawyers have spent their life being the smartest kid in the class or the hardest working kid in the class and getting good marks. And getting a bad mark is a horrible thing for a lawyer or a law student. If you're a salesperson, the majority of time that you spend results in a no. Unless you're the world's greatest salesperson ever and you're batting over 500, you get a lot of rejection every single day. And so there's just a different sort of mental makeup that you have to have. And so I said to myself, well, there's lots of reasons why I shouldn't do something, but being afraid to do it shouldn't be something that I would want to live my life by. And I thought, if I say no for that reason, I'm going to live to regret it. So I remember I was in a course at the time, because Thomson Reuters was always very supportive of me, and they put me in this course for people who were likely to become general counsels of publicly traded companies. And I talked to 3 general counsels, sitting general counsels of US Fortune 500 companies. And I asked them, what do you think I should do? They all said, don't do it. They said, number one, you're probably going to fail. Number two, your background isn't lined up for this. And then number 3, if you are successful, you'll never get a job to be general counsel, so you'll be off of the legal track. And for people who know me, they should know that when people say that I can't do something or probably shouldn't do something, it's probably going to encourage me to want to do it. So I went and did it. It was the hardest thing that I've ever done. It humbled me. It almost broke me. But it was also the making of me, because I learned, first of all, I learned how to dust myself off and stand up after getting knocked down, because that is just the nature of sales. There was a point when I went, and obviously the business wasn't in crisis, because they wouldn't take such a huge risk to send someone like me unless things were already bad. The business was in a tailspin by the time I landed. Soon after I landed, there was one weekend where the head of account management, the head of sales, the head of human resources, and the head of partnerships all said, as people would do in China in those days, we are sick and we're not coming back in. And they were just basically essentially saying we're not returning to work. But by the nature of the laws, people would say that. That was a difficult blow, to be someone who was relying on these people, and then suddenly having to do the hardest thing I've ever done without my senior leadership team. So I remember going back into the office. I didn't think what they were doing was right, and I spoke to the corporate headquarters, and we agreed we should not allow anyone to hold us to ransom, and that we were going to continue to operate the business. We did, and it taught me that there's great talent, human capital within an organization, and if you dig down and try to uncover that talent, you can find some gems. I found new people to rise up. I brought in some people from the outside. We turned that business around. By the time that I left 2 years later, it was one of the top performing business units when we sold it and handed it over to Blackstone.
Nice.
It had the highest employee morale. It went from having the lowest employee morale in the company to having the highest when we left. And so it was just a great, it's like a PhD in crisis leadership, in business management. And oftentimes lawyers are trying to figure out, how do I get that business acumen? No better way than running a business, to really understand all of that. Then I came back. Thompson, Reuters invited me to come back and to run the separation of its business from the financial and risk business that we sold to Blackstone. And so that was mostly a technology job. So I went from being a general counsel and a chief compliance officer to running a P&L for 2 years, to then spending a year. And as you say, Ken, I took that job knowing that if I was successful, I would have no job. So again, it seemed like maybe it wasn't the smartest career move, but it was a great way for a lawyer, again, to be inside a technology organization, to be responsible for operations, and to really learn the craft of execution. And then when I was offered the great privilege of becoming chief legal officer for Thomson Reuters, I was told if I hadn't made those choices, if I didn't have that business background, if I didn't have that technology background, I would have been a lot less interesting of a candidate to become the head of legal for the corporation. So it did turn out, in hindsight, that those are great things to do. At the time, they seemed like exactly the wrong things to do. But my advice to people coming up is, figure out what you have a passion about and follow that passion, and it will take you in different places. But I do think now it is much more common for boards and for CEOs to value a general counsel that has a broad range of experience, that is going to be a business partner, is going to be an equal member of the small table when you're talking about strategy and you're talking about the big decisions for the corporation. And I think any of us who are lawyers would rather be that person than be someone who's just in a small legal box. As wonderful as that box is, I think one of the great things about being a GC, as you know, Ken, is being an executive and being part of the executive team, because what's really fun is the team sport of leading a business. It's great to be a lawyer and it's great to be the top lawyer, but I think those of us who enjoy being general counsels enjoy the collective win that we get when the business is successful.
So well said. But you made a decision there to come back into the law, right? I mean,
That's right.
You were successful in business. You could have stayed in the business, on the business side. What sort of drew you back into that role? Was it the role of general counsel and the business partner that you were going to be in that role?
Well, the great thing was by not being in the law for 3 years, it actually reminded me that I love the law,
Okay.
and that I am good at it. And I think it was helpful, because I think it's a little bit like if you never traveled the world, you don't really know how wonderful of a place your hometown is in a way. And so I think you need that experience to get some perspective. And I think when you come back, you are a better person for the experience and the journey that you went on. And so after those 3 years, I did have my conviction that, and I never actually started this thinking that I didn't want to be a general counsel. That always remained sort of my goal. But I also think it says a lot about Thomson Reuters that it asked me to do a really difficult thing. And you said this at the beginning, Ken. They asked me to do a really hard thing that was at great risk to myself. And it's wonderful that they remembered who I was and that I was on this track and that they valued me for it. And I think that's a sign of a good organization, which is an organization that allows you to take great risk for the benefit of the organization and rewards people for doing so. And so I think it's a great sign of the culture that we have at Thomson Reuters that I was able to do those things and then return to the position that was always sort of my goal.
You must have had great trust in the organization.
I did.
Because you don't necessarily say yes to all the things you say yes to, not knowing what's going to come after unless you trust the organization to do the right thing.
I did have great trust in the organization, but also to be honest, and this is true for anybody, when you make a career change, you're flying, hoping that you don't need to use a parachute, and maybe it's there, but you won't know unless you pull the ripcord.
Right.
And so there is a great sense of unease when you do that, just to be honest. But I also think it's helpful for lawyers to feel that, because our business partners who are, let's say, like when you're talking to a salesperson, a majority of their compensation comes from, an incentive program that's based upon how successful that they are. So their life and how successful they are in a given year goes up or down. So it's also good for lawyers to experience that uncertainty, to understand what the people they work with are dealing with as well, and the customers that they're dealing with, right? So if you are in a law firm, there's a difference between being a lawyer who is paid a salary and being a partner who also has those ups and downs, which is also different from, let's say, a solo practitioner who it's all on them, right? And so I do think it's important for lawyers to understand what it means for people who have an absolute dependency on being successful and that people are being dependent on them. It makes you a better provider of legal services to that person and a better partner to that person, to understand how important it is, this activity that you're working on together.
The thing I learned also from you was that you not only took the risk, you learned a lot from it. You learned a lot about yourself. You learned a lot about the business, all of which made you a better person and a better general counsel. But it also made you an active participant on the executive team. And you came back 2019, but then almost you were onto a new CFO, a new CEO, the pandemic, strategic work that you did, and you played a critical role in all of that. And tell us a little bit about that, how that all came about.
Yeah, so I became the chief legal officer in 2019, and that was towards the end of the tenure of our former CEO, Jim Smith, who had a fantastic run. And so, we were already into CEO succession mode at that point, and his successor, our current CEO, Steve Hasker, was appointed in the beginning of March 2020. So let's flash back to what was going on in March 2020. So March 2020, I think our stock had hit an all-time high. So it seemed to be a fitting moment for a CEO and a CFO and a general counsel to all sort of be exiting, to say, we had a really good run. We brought the stock to an all-time high. It's really good. And everyone's question at the time was, how will the new CEO, the new CFO, the new general counsel, how will this team follow up on that act? So we had that going on. As I was preparing for the board meeting where we would be naming the new CEO, I began to hear about this disease, which we've been tracking in Asia in 2019, crossing over into Europe. Then I started to hear that it was spreading very quickly in Italy. I started getting questions from board members about whether or not we were going to still have our board meeting in person. We decided to have it in person. And in real time, the situation was getting worse. We named Steve as the new CEO. And as soon as he took over, we were full in the pandemic. Canada was in lockdown. The border was shutting down. Our stock price took a big drop, as everyone's did. And it seemed like it was a really bad time to be starting as a new management team. I would give a lot of credit to our CEO, Steve Hasker, because he saw it from the very beginning as an opportunity to drive change. We were already going to have to make a massive change within the organization to accomplish what we wanted to do strategically. I'll give another real shout out to Steve, because from the very beginning of the pandemic, he made sure the executive team spent as much time dealing with the ongoing crisis as it did thinking about the future. So we did not immediately go into, don't worry about growth, don't worry about strategy, don't worry about ambition. All you got to figure out is how we're going to get through this month. We were having simultaneous conversations around how do we manage this incredibly epic sized crisis we're all dealing with, but also what do we need to be doing now so that when we get on the other side of this, we'll be where we want to be. And so they teach you these things in business school and the management course. Very hard to pull that off in real life when the crisis is upon you. Mm-hmm. So I was lucky that, Steve's management style for his top team is to be very inclusive and to welcome input from people. So I'm lucky because I want to give that input as the chief legal officer. And I'm fortunate that my CEO is receptive to hearing that from folks. And I'm also very fortunate that we have a business that also serves lawyers, because oftentimes I can be the voice of the customer in the room, not just myself as the head of our legal function, but also myself as a practicing lawyer. And so it's been a really wonderful opportunity for me to be part of the top table when we talk about what are we trying to do, what are the trends that we're seeing, where should we allocate our resources, how should we prioritize things. But it's our leadership style at Thomson Reuters to be that, not just for myself, but we believe that the best executive teams are getting that input and diversity of thought around the big decisions. Then we make a decision, and then we're all on board to execute it, right? So we welcome constructive debate, we welcome dissenting opinions, but when we make a decision, everyone has to get on board and execute it.
But it gave you an opportunity to be in New York with your two colleagues, the two most senior colleagues, and spend your time to do the strategic reset.
Well, it was a great time and an opportunity for me because I didn't know Steve. Steve was new to the organization. And so, I knew Mike, our CFO. He and I had known each other for a long time and had been in some business units together. But when you have a new CEO, it's so important as the general counsel to spend time with the CEO. And then we just went into like a virtual lockdown where everyone was on, video conferences. So the fact that, and we crossed over from Canada to the US because we knew the border was likely going to close soon. And most of our revenue base and most of our customers are in the US. So we all came down. And so for a big part of the pandemic, it was just the three of us in our Times Square office with one assistant. But it was a great opportunity for me to spend some time with our new CEO, which I wouldn't have had if I was just on the other end of a Zoom from them. And so, no, it was a great opportunity for me. And I think because everyone already realized that we had to change anyways in response to the pandemic, it was a great time for us to launch this transformation, which we call the change program within the company. So it ended up being, again, sort of hindsight, it all makes sense. It ended up being a very good time to start as a management team and, sort of start a new program and then to drive to even greater success, which we've had since, we've been together as a leadership team.
So how much of the 20 years before that, Thomas, and you're clearly saying yes to all of these things, including a big business risk that you took on in China, how much of all that formed you as a general counsel to be able to look at that pandemic 2 years ago and take it as an opportunity and be flexible and say yes and all of that stuff? It must have played a huge role in who you were as a general counsel to sort of be comfortable with that change, all that change that would happen 2 years ago.
Well, absolutely. One, having run a P&L and having turned a business around, you get used to a high pressure situation that could actually result in failure. So that's helpful to understand when you're heading into unknown waters. Two, having overseen the separation of our financial and risk business, which was half of our company, and pulling those technology systems apart and building new technology systems gives you more comfort with the challenge of dealing with technology that you're really focused on during a transformation as we currently have. So absolutely. And even with regards to how I sort of reimagined what our legal department would be like. If I hadn't been through those experiences, I don't think I would have initiated what I initiated, what we call Project Velocity, which is a reimagining of our legal department into a much more technology enabled, much flatter, a scalable, agile organization that looks much more similar to a business unit or a product or engineering team than it does to a traditional legal hierarchy. If I hadn't had those experiences, I wouldn't have thought that was possible. I wouldn't have also come to the position of thinking that we could try some fundamentally, radically different things in terms of our commercial policies and how we sell things and how we manage the legal support if I hadn't been on the business side of things. Because I think lawyers tend to look at things in a very analog way, to sort of sequentially thinking about, I do this first and then I do that. While if you've had to sort of think about things on an organizational level, you realize that some of the critical decisions you have to make are some of the riskiest ones, but they have the biggest scalable payback later. And so I think those experiences helped me to figure out, during the crisis that we faced and during the current ongoing challenges that we have, including so many people sort of reflecting on whether or not they want to change jobs, whether you call it the great reflection or the great sort of repositioning of people. I think legal practice has changed so much. And if I hadn't had those other experiences, I think I would have approached how we respond to that differently.
I always just sort of had in my mind that what you were talking about was the integration of your team into the business, because about a third of your revenues come out of the legal space. So you're well situated to be, as you say, the guinea pig, or to work it through and get the benefits of that from a technology standpoint. But also so it's not only about integrating the business into the law team, it's also about integrating the law department into the business itself. And that's, I think, where you hit the sweet spot as a general counsel, where you're seen as a business partner that understands the business in a way that you can facilitate more business. That's sort of what I took away when we had our conversation, and you've described it so well now. But so you sort of look at that and say that business component of it. I mean, I always have wondered whether that should be part of the career development of general counsel, is for organizations and also for general counsel themselves to take on that risk, to move into the business, to operate a P&L and understand the business better. That should be part of the requirement. It seemed to be the case at Thomson Reuters that was seen as a real positive for you, taking on the role from your predecessor. I don't know why we don't do more of that. Is it because lawyers are risk adverse? They don't want to take that challenge themselves? Or is it because businesses aren't thinking out of the box in terms of the critical role that general counsel play? Which do you think it is?
I actually think it's changing. So certainly it was rare when I was coming up as a lawyer, but since I've become a general counsel and I talked to other GCs, I've met other folks who have also run a P&L or run a business in some way. And so I think it's becoming more common. And so I think you're right, Ken. I think people now realize it's important for someone to understand that, and I've also seen people, for example, one of our board members, Kim Rivera, when she was at HP, she was both the chief legal officer and she was running strategy and business development. So I do think people have come to recognize that in order to be a highly successful chief legal officer, having a business and strategic mindset is helpful. And so I think that's changing. I still do think that for traditional ways of how we train lawyers, we train people to not take any risks. And so that's difficult. To be successful in business, you have to be able to identify and make intelligent choices around risk and to take risk. And that's different from eliminating risk, which I think was the traditional model of how we were taught as lawyers. And I think now it's much more around identifying, quantifying, and then managing risk, right? And so what I would say, that's what a business also has to do, just generally.
I'll be curious if anybody listening in on this, and particularly the younger lawyers in-house, out of this conversation, listening to you and the impact it's had on you as an individual, as a lawyer, and as a business leader in Thomson Reuters, whether any of them go out and make a request to actually move into the business for a while. I'll be curious if anybody's listening in. Let me know. I'd love to hear that story. I think we've covered off so much, but I want to be sure before we finish at 2:00 Eastern time that I cover off a few things, because you've had so many experiences in so many different places. And you're also an American who I know we won't get into this because we could talk a long time on this, your reflections on the Canadian legal market, general counsel market versus the US one. And I know you think very highly of Canadian lawyers and the Canadian legal marketplace, which is wonderful. And I would just like to say it's been a pleasure having you join us as the fraternity in amongst Canadian general counsel, because you're a huge addition to the profession here. So thank you for that. But I don't want to let you off the hook without asking a few kind of personal questions, if you don't mind. Sure. I know one time from an interview you did, you took your daughter to a business conference, and she actually came to listen to you speak. And that was a wonderful thing for a father to be able to do, or for any parent for that matter, to have a child listen to them actually do things. So that one maybe can't come on to this, but I'm wondering if you have any advice. What would be your most significant leadership advice, particularly for younger in-house lawyers that are listening in today?
I think one of the things that there's two things that I would pass on, Ken, and I think we've talked about both of them. One of them is to do what interests you. I think sometimes we say follow your passion, but I think that puts a big burden because it makes it seem as if you have to be all consumed by something. But I think you have to really enjoy what you're doing. And even if that takes you into different directions, I think that is a better way to live your life and to have a career than to say there's some sort of roadmap that I'm following. And related to that, we've also talked about is be willing to take some risks. Even if you fail, and there's a possibility that you will, because it's like baseball or sales. The law of averages means if you're really trying to do something hard, every now and then you're going to fall down, and that's okay, right? So that's what I would give advice to people is, and I even today, as we were in a team meeting with one of my teams here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and I was saying, don't be afraid to take risks, even if it means that we fail, because we'll learn something from that. But besides that, we'll never do anything great if we're afraid to try to do something that's hard. And so that's the advice that I pass on.
That's great advice, and also requires the trust in the leader to make sure that they truly understand that they won't be fired if they happen to take the risk and fail, because if it's good risk, it's worth taking. So do you have one regret over your 23-year career at Thomson Reuters?
Well, I would say this is something that we all have as regrets, I think, is, it's just very, very difficult to have enough time to spend with people that you love outside of work. I think it'd be a fallacy to say that there's work-life balance. To operate at the highest level takes a lot of time. You're on the road also as well. And so I think it's just important to recognize that it's important to try as hard as you can to fulfill that part of your life, because we're whole people. And if, with a W, whole people, and if you forget about that part of you that is your private life, then you become a whole without the W. And that leaves a vacant part of you. And that's not good for you personally and not good for you as a career. So it would be false to say that I don't look back and say, I wish I could find more time. And I am always striving to do that. But I think all of us have that as a challenge. But I think it's important to talk about it, because oftentimes it's sort of, people get the false impression that if you just figure out how to do this right, then you won't have that challenge. And I just think it is a challenge that we all try to manage the best that we can. Excellent.
Well, I know you've done a wonderful job. Like I said, your wonderful daughter is somebody who's been a part of your career throughout all of this, as well as your wife. So, do you have 2 or 3 accomplishments you look back on now? We've talked about a lot of them. Certainly China, the business opportunity would be one, but do you have 2 or 3 accomplishments you're most proud of?
Well, if we sort of broaden into just generally, number one would be being a parent. So that is always going to be my proudest accomplishment in the family life that I built with my wife. I'm proud that I took a risk to do things, whether it's becoming the leader of the business in China or leading the separation, and not letting fear drive my decision making. And the third thing that I would say is when I look out and I see how successful people that used to work with me or work for me are, then I feel, having pride like a parent. right? So you see other people becoming general counsels, you see them prospering, and that makes you wonderfully proud, and continues to do so.
And I know your predecessor must be very proud of you as well. I know that you speak very highly of Deidre Stanley, and I think that's a wonderful relationship that you have with her as well. You see her as a mentor. So that is wonderful. So I want to thank you. It's been a real pleasure. You and I have spent time together over the last few years, and I've always enjoyed our conversations because you bring such a unique and important perspective to the role of general counsel and the development of that role. And I just think it's wonderful what you've accomplished there. And I want to thank you for spending this hour with me. I would like to remind you, because you're a little bit a part of this as well, that my next guest on Table Talks is Jeffrey Hewitt, who's general counsel at Chippewas of Rama First Nation, and also a professor of law at Osgood Law School. He's a significant leader, Indigenous leader in the legal community. And Thompson Reuters was working with Deloitte in terms of preparing a video, which we're going to launch when I have that conversation with him as well. So I want to give you thanks for your part in what you did around that, because it's going to be an important contribution to reconciliation. So thank you very much. And to everyone listening in, I just want to thank you again for your hour. I know time is valuable. Sitting in another Zoom call can now be a pretty bad thing to do, but I hope that you've enjoyed this one. I know I certainly have. Thomas, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Ken.
All right. Have a nice day. Cheers.
Thank you.